today by talking about falls in seniors in general, and then branch into about a 60,000-foot view of my main research project that has been spanning for a few years. And it's not all triumphant. I've had some tribulations along the way with this project, and I don't yet know where it's going to end up. So I just want to show you what research in this area looks like in the type of project that I'm working on. So that's my goal for today. And so I want to let you know that this doesn't happen at any school or any research community without a team approach. And here at Willamette, our team is made up of, well, a faculty member and also student research assistants. And so since the summer of 2013, I've had some students get involved in this project. And so Maggie and Theo started this in the summer of 2013, and then Jamil joined in a few years later. And then not too long ago, I don't know how it's already a couple of years on the calendar ago, we had Josh, Estefania, and Shay. Some of you have participated in this research and you recognize some of these students. And then just recently, I had Alex and Mark working in the lab and testing in a location at Gacke Hall here on our campus. And now we have Maggie and Estefania joining us. Now this is a different Maggie than in 2013. This Maggie's actually in the room back there. Hello, Maggie. And so she's getting started with the project. It is the same Estefania as a couple of summers ago, who is working on the project again. And so these students are the frontline warriors who are helping with all manner of the project to get this administered. So first, I'd like to talk a bit about the problem of falls for older adults. So I'm going to do this with this opener. If a young college student trips and falls, there's probably going to be some finger pointing and laughing and you know, commiserating. You know that this kind of carries some sense that if you know you're old, if you fall down and no one laughs, because we are very well aware of the hazards of falling. We know that it doesn't always work out well after impact with the ground. Sometimes this can be very serious. We know that it's a pretty common issue. Jim told us that about half the lunch table can report a fall, and we know that at least, and maybe more than a third of community-dwelling older adults fall each year, and we know that that proportion is, of course, higher in individuals who live in assisted living communities, for example. We know it's a leading cause of non-fatal injuries and hospital admissions for trauma, and it's the leading cause of death due to injury in older adults as well. So it's not always the case that every fall results in an injury. If we're lucky, we'll get back up, dust ourselves off, our pride is a little bruised. Sometimes there's more than that happens. Sometimes there are fractures that occur. Hip fractures, of course, are things that you have heard about. You may know a friend or have had yourself or a family member experience a hip fracture as a result of a fall, and you've seen what it takes to get back from that. So you are aware of this problem. And not only can it lead to injury, but we can also have some problems with our functioning in society as a result of fearing a fall in the first place. So if a person becomes rather hesitant and is fearing a fall, they may curtail their activities. They may then indeed decondition their bodies and become less able to confront slips and trips when they happen. They will perceive that loss of function that's occurring because of this pulling back of physical activities. And this results in a downward negative spiral, as they call it, where you perceive the new aggravated instability, you pull back on your physical activities even further, your body becomes even less conditioned, and therefore you sense that more, and you do less, and you become more and more at risk. And so this is a downward negative spiral that can happen even if someone doesn't have a fall, if they have a substantial fear of falling. So this is a concern that can reach people even who haven't fallen. And so it's something worth talking about, and I do want to assure you that even if you don't read about it all the time in the popular press, there is a lot of research going on in this area, all manner of fall risk factors and understanding the problem of falls in seniors. There is a very healthy research community across the world trying to address little bits and pieces of this. How do we understand it? How do we measure it? And what can we do to prevent it? So I'm just going to talk now about the various fall risk factors that we are aware of. This is a somewhat comprehensive list, though some things may be popping up on our awareness now that are not yet included in a list like this. But one thing that we know is if a person has already fallen, then we know that this shakes out as an independent predictor for a future fall. So if a physician were to detect that from a patient, they should be on alert that this person is now at an increased risk of another fall, and we should be thinking about what's going on there. Now, some falls we know can come out of a gait deficit. So if a person has a difficulty with walking and moving about, then this represents a risk factor for falling. And this also, this poor health is something that needs to be attended to. It could be that a fall is occurring because of a cardiovascular condition that needs to be recognized and treated, and that may be a major cause for an individual. It might be that it's a chronic condition that is creating some increased risk of falling for an individual. So a medical evaluation is certainly very, very warranted to rule out medical contributors to fall risk status. In addition to the gait deficit, the sister to that would be a balance deficit. If someone has some postural instability, so having an inability to maintain uprightness, then that represents a risk factor for falling. Many, many studies have quantified gait deficits and balance deficits in a variety of different ways, some of them very static, like how well do you stand very still in a challenging situation like feet together, or maybe your feet in front of each other, or you stand on one foot. Can you do those sorts of things? Some of them are very dynamic, where you're trying to reach as far as you can without having to take a step, or you're doing some walking and we're doing some either high-tech or low-tech evaluation of the walking performance. And actually, if I were to go back to those two and just show you where this presentation is going, it's those two that I'm going to really be focusing on. We can do a lot of high-tech measurements of gait and balance deficits. Translating them into a low-tech, really clinically feasible measurement of function is where we are still attempting to make some progress. Okay, sorry, I skipped to the use of assistive device. I'll go back to that. It is also known that if a person is using an assistive device, this over a population can be an independent predictor, or is an independent predictor of increasing the risk of falls. And it's probable, and it's long been thought that this just represented that a person has a sufficient mobility difficulty that warrants an assistive device, and that's why this is shaking out on our fall risk factor lists. But there's also some research that's telling us that perhaps we could improve the design of the assistive devices. So for example, if somebody is using a walker and they experience an instability or a loss of balance, if the wheel of the walker is in the way of their recovery step, then that could represent a problem with the design of the walker itself that's increasing the risk of falling if a person has some instability. Now, that's not to say that a person should avoid assistive devices, because that's going to increase my risk of falling. What we do know from a very healthy body of long-term research is that assistive devices improve access. They increase the amount of mobility in the environment and social participation, so they are to be encouraged. We do know that the old-fashioned concern that, well, if I use this, then my body's going to decondition too fast because I'm going to be relying on this more, so my balance and my strength are going to be reducing. So therefore, I'm going to put it off. I'm not going to use this assistive device that the medical professionals are telling me is warranted. We know that that is not founded. Instead, what we see is people participate more, they do more, they walk more when they have an appropriate assistive device if it's needed. So this is an area that's still actively being researched to try and figure out how do we make improvements in the design so that they don't then accidentally introduce a risk for falling themselves. Poor sleep has also shaken out as a risk factor for falling. If you don't have your wits about you and you're tired, then all manner of things in the body can go in a negative direction, including your ability to keep your balance. And a whole lot of our successful mobility in society also has to do with how well we can do a couple things at once. Can we walk and talk at the same time, for example? And those sorts of things certainly get very difficult when we are having a poor quality of sleep. Visual deficit also makes the list of fall risk factors. So vision deficits need to be corrected in order to reduce the risk. There's also some interesting research out of Australia that raises a red flag with the use of bifocals or multifocals, because if you are, while, not just in general, but while walking. So imagine that I'm wearing bifocals and the lower part of my lens is dedicated to a reading distance. If I'm trying to walk and see where the obstacles are and this next step coming up, if I'm trying to see where that is, well, if I look through that bottom part of my lens, then it's not the right distance. It's blurry. So what I'm left to do is look over it like this, and then I can see the step or the obstacle that I'm trying to manage, but then I've changed my posture perhaps a fair amount. So there's some concern about whether that might be problematic in people. So something to keep in mind if you are wearing multifocal lenses is that to pay attention to what that requires of you. Consider that perhaps when you are just walking around, maybe it's worth having a second pair of glasses that are not for reading while you're walking around, and that you might switch into a multi-lens or a bifocal when you know you're going to sit down and perhaps need to interact with some text at that point. So something to think about and be mindful of. As I mentioned before, having a fear of falling increases the risk of falling because of this long-term negative spiral. Now, that's not to say that we need to have a head-in-the-sand approach, but just to be mindful of the negative effects on participation and conditioning of the body that can come out of having a fear of falling that makes us pull back from participation. Some things are good for us to stop doing, right? Tell me you're not still on your roof, right? I wish my parents would listen to me on this one. By the way, I forgot to mention early on, feel free to stop me anytime if you have some questions that you want to just shout out. No, that's not okay? Okay, never mind. Never mind. I won't allow it. Put your hands down. All right, so the point is, there are some things that naturally we should curtail as we become older, as our balance and gait capabilities start to limit a little bit. Being on the roof is one of those things. Generally, we don't count that against a person as quantifying that, oh, you must have a fear of falling that's in excess because you are no longer getting up on your roof. Now, that is considered reasonable. But getting out to the grocery store, it would be in that category of a very concerning activity that would represent a significant fear of falling if someone were not doing that anymore because of this fear. Arthritis increases the risk of falling. We know that there's a whole host of things that go on with this. Not only does it hurt, and that pain changes your movement, but we know that the joint also becomes stiffer. So there's multi-level issues that come up with arthritis. And we also know that if a person has, for example, arthritis in one side, let's say my left hip, I may actually change my gait in a way that really causes an accelerated decline of a joint on my right side, that it might ultimately get worse than the initial side. And so this can represent some changes in your movement that over time accumulate to be pretty destructive for other joints as well. Social connectivity shakes out as an independent predictor of falls in older adults, meaning, and it's not just social support. So for example, you think of someone who maybe is homebound You know that person needs people to go check on them, maybe help with some things around the house, help with some what we call instrumental activities of daily living, like shopping, managing finances, managing home repair, et cetera. That's a social support category, if we put that into the jargon of the researchers. Social connectivity is that feeling of being connected to other people, that feeling of being a part of a group, that feeling of being known and understood, of not being forgotten. This is social connection. The opposite of that would be social isolation. And so social support and social isolation or connectivity, they both separately predict falls in seniors. So coming out to groups like this is a great way to maintain that social connectivity as we get older. Impaired activities of daily living. If a person reports that they're having trouble going about their typical activities of daily living, that is a flag that we know increases the risk of falling in older adults. Home hazards. So this has to do with throw rugs that might curl and you catch your foot on them. And it also has to do with like those same rugs that might slip on the floor, clutter in the home, cables that stretch in walkways. These sorts of things are considered home hazards. And we know that when those exist, when an occupational therapist, for example, when they do a big study and they go out into the home and they document how many of these things exist, that this shakes out as predicting falls in seniors as well. But the confusing thing about this is we don't have evidence that removing home hazards makes a big difference. So it's hard to say if it's underlying, if it's kind of just representing some other kind of lack of care of the environment, for example, or just kind of correlated to some other risk factor. We're not totally sure. What we do know is while just removing home hazards may not be enough, adding in home modification does help. That does reduce falls. Adding in the grab bars, the railings on the stairs, the supportive safety equipment, that we know reduces falls in seniors. And so that is something that's really promising that's on the home front. But it's not the very first recommendation we make because it's not the biggest risk factor. The biggest ones are coming up. Depression is a problem. Depression increases the risk of falling in seniors. Sadly, treating it with certain kinds of medications also increases the risk of falling because those have a real neural effect. Happily, there are other ways to treat depression or prevent it or beat it back a bit that also have a positive effect on the body, and that would be exercise interventions. Improving the fitness of the body has a positive effect on the mind and mood and cognition and physical capacity. So you're not left without any option unless a person is unable to physically participate in exercise, and that we know occurs as well. So this is a difficult situation. On this note with depression, I want to point out that another risk factor for falling is something called polypharmacy, fancy word for, are you taking more than 4 medications? If you are, then this, we know, increases the risk of falling. That's not to say that every single individual, you're now up to 5, there you go. We know that these are risk factors, right? They're not specific causative factors where, well, if this happens, you will for sure get this. But we know that this increases the risk of falling. And there have been really interesting studies that have pharmacists evaluate the medication list of individual patients. They are successful in whittling it down by identifying which things really don't go well together and which things are really problematic for this kind of an outcome, and that has reduced falls in big samples of people. So this is something that's worth really paying attention to. I have this linked here, and it's because I have this. That is a link put up by the CDC that I thought was really useful. That talks about this issue, talking about not only falls, but also car crashes, because the same sorts of mental faculties and physical abilities that go into being able to resist a fall are also relevant to the ability to drive as well. And so I'm going to just kind of slide on down, because I know you want to know What about my medicine? And here on the right side are medication categories and a couple of specific examples that are in this realm of medications that could affect how your body's neurons transmit signals and therefore could make you react a little slower to things like a trip event, and therefore a fall can be more likely. It might affect the ability of your blood pressure to rapidly adjust to your changing postural demands as you go about daily activities. It might impact the speed of decision making when driving, for example. So these are things that are relevant for an individual. And if you see something on this list that is relevant to you, that doesn't necessarily mean you should not be taking that. That's, of course, something that's going to have to be weighed with the pros and cons list with your physician as far as what would happen if you didn't take that. That might be worse than being very extra careful of when you do take it to be mindful of these things. So have that conversation in order to know that you've put eyes on this interesting risk factor. Okay. Cognitive impairment definitely significantly increases the risk of falling. What's interesting here, too, is that a reduction in physical capacity, so a measurable balance or gait deficit, often precedes a measurable cognitive deficit. And so sometimes you can see it coming, in retrospect, by having noticed a change in physical function, and then comes the change in cognitive function. So this has been documented in several studies of dementia where the physical seems to come before the cognitive. The physical really is driven in large part by the same area of the brain, the frontal lobe, where some of the big dementias really take effect. And so that kind of makes sense that in a lobe of the brain here in the front, where a lot of these higher level executive cognitive function processes take place, it's also the same lobe where our movement control is managed. So that's something that increases the risk of falling. If you're older than 80, that's also an independent risk factor for falls. This tells us, well, maybe there's something else about age that we're not capturing in these other factors. So we're still trying to figure this out, but at the very least, if someone is older than 80, we might think, okay, some of these other things may be going on here, and this will make us look a little carefully at the situation. The weather increases, certain weather conditions increase the risk of falling. So for example, obviously, if there's ice on the ground, then we know that hospitalization rates due to falls increases for every age group, but specifically for seniors. But we also have studies that tell us that if there's cold weather, cold temperature, even in the absence of snow and ice being on the ground, that cold temperature increases the risk of falling in seniors. So that's an area of ongoing research, mainly up in Canada, where I was, where they have cold weather simulators, and they're trying to understand what's the difference that this makes on the way a person moves. Is there something about the cold that makes us move in a way that is increasing our risk? Certainly if we're all tensed up, then we're not able to move flexibly. If we co-contract all of our muscles, we know that in lab studies where people are doing that, then if there's a sudden perturbation, because of course we have like gizmos that people stand on in labs that toss them off balance like this, and we measure how well they regain their balance. When they are co-contracted, which maybe is what's happening in very cold weather, we know that that reduces their ability to successfully recover their balance. So maybe it's something like that. Maybe it's something about the clothing, something about what we do to warm ourselves that is stifling our senses or binding us up so we can't really walk well. This is an ongoing area to try and figure this out. We don't know. Or is it also just that people reduce their activity so much that they're becoming deconditioned in an acute way that could lead to a chronic way as well? Muscle weakness, this one shakes out as the biggest problem. And if muscle weakness is present, this increases the risk above like by a larger factor than these others. This is the biggest risk factor that we know of. There are some related ones here, and I'm animating those as well. And these are coming out, the low muscle power and the physical inactivity, as also being separate, independent predictors. So muscle power is different than muscle strength, in that muscle strength is just how much force you can exert, but muscle power adds in a speed component. How fast can you exert that force? Because if I can exert enough force to hold me like this and keep me from falling, like if I trip and I can exert enough force with my extensor muscles that I don't fall to the ground, that's good, but if I can't do that fast enough, then I will fall, right? So the speed element is also separately important. Strength and power are important for seniors. Yes, power training is a thing for seniors. You thought it was only for Olympic training, like the power lifts. No, it doesn't mean you have to do the clean and jerk or the deadlift for it to be power training. Power training would be when you do the exertion rapidly. Then you're training your muscle to increase its ability to generate force rapidly. So for example, let's imagine your physical therapist has trained you to do some chair stands as a way to get some exercise. So you stand up from a chair and you sit back down, right? It's like a squat exercise, but you may or may not be holding on to additional weights, right? And so the idea would be to transform this from a strength activity into a power activity. You would work toward doing the up phase rapidly. The down phase, not rapidly. That's not comfortable to flop back into the chair. So the down phase, the return recovery phase, always done slowly. And then the phase on the way up. Once you're safe to do so and you feel you can handle that instability that may come with that, you gradually work to doing that rapidly, as fast as you safely can. That, we know, those types of changes increase the ability to create power, to generate that force rapidly, instead of only being able to generate it eventually. Okay, now, like I said, my project that I'm going to tell you about is really within this realm here of the gait and the balance. But you'll see that I'm talking about other factors that come up that are in these other realms here. And if you participate in my project, then you'll notice that I might ask you about some of these other things here, just to be able to document these things as well. But what I'm really trying to do is improve our ability to identify when someone has a gait or a balance deficit. So I'm going to tell you about the problem that I'm working on in particular. One of the aspects of function that we know is relevant to, that increases the risk of falling in older adults is the ability to move your body weight side to side. Now notice that you may think that this is something that only new moms do with their babies, and it's not only that. So when I walk forward, maybe you didn't see it, but I was moving sideways. Now I'll go slowly. You see it now. If I just want to lift a foot and step forward, now you can see it when I go slowly. So I'm being dramatic, right? I don't need to move my weight that far in order to walk. I mean, I can, it looks great. But it's happening even if the objective of a movement is to move forward. This side-to-side motion is difficult as we get older. We don't have a lot of muscles that are dedicated to managing this. We have some here at the hip, right? If I push myself sideways, it's these hip abductors on the side of the hips that push me sideways. These are big players in that, and they should be kept strong, and they seem to be relevant in this. But there's also something about a variety of other muscles that push against the ground that do this. If I want to lift my foot, my left foot, first I have to push on the ground with that foot to move myself to my right foot so that I can actually lift my foot and balance before I step. If I don't, and I just lift my left foot, what's going to happen? It's like just taking away the peg of a stool, and you just fall in that direction. So instead, you have to coordinate a lot of muscles to add just the right amount of force and just the right amount of time in order to shift your weight to the side in order to be successful just moving forward. And this is something that we know breaks down sooner as we get older than other aspects of our control of our motion. So it's worth paying attention to this side-to-side motion, and it's something that we don't really have a good way to measure in the clinic. In the clinic, there are some nice measures of strength and static balance and walking function, but we don't really have a way to just really zoom in on this side-to-side motion and figure out how are you doing with that aspect. We have some high-tech ways of doing this, but we don't have a low-tech way that's available to a physical therapist's office, for example. Some physical therapists can afford some fancy high-tech gizmos to make this measurement, but those are expensive and often require some kind of expertise to be able to evaluate the signals that come out of these gizmos, this high-tech, like some kind of a movement sensor. So what I'm trying to do is use these high-tech movement sensors and correlate it with some low-tech observational measures of how many times can you tap your foot to see if we can come up with a clinically feasible test of rapid weight shifting motion for the clinic that could help ultimately one day to predict a person's fall risk. So how do you develop a clinical test? You should go through a few steps. The first one, it needs to be easy to conduct, right? Not expensive gadgetry that requires a lot of expertise. It should be simple to learn and easy and fast to do. It should be valid. If I say this test represents your ability to move your weight rapidly side to side, I should have some reason to say that. I should have evaluated it against a known, somewhat gold standard measurement of side-to-side movement. It needs to be reliable. Now this means that if I make the measurement, I should get the same number of counts. I should count the same number of steps as the next person observing that. It shouldn't be hard to count, right? It should be something that is reliable between observers. This also means, though, that it needs to be repeatable. So if I bring a person into the clinic and I test them on this today, and then I bring them in next week, and nothing happened in between. I didn't do any physical exercise intervention. The person didn't get sick and decondition. I would expect to see the same performance. If their physical performance was the same, this test should result in the same score. It should be a good predictor. Ultimately, if I want to say this is going to be useful in fall risk screenings in a clinical environment, it needs to do a good job of saying, well, if you can score above this number of foot taps on this test, then you are not at an increased risk of falling. If you score under this number, then we know that that increases your risk by a factor of 2 or something like that. Okay? That's what a good predictor is. It needs to be able to predict some negative downstream event. It could be a fall, but of course we know that a fall isn't the only negative outcome. It can be a loss of functional mobility status. So if a test can predict that in a year your walking function, it looks like you're on the road to it being compromised, or a hospitalization event, those are the scary downstream negative bad things that a good test would predict. It needs to be responsive. That means, let's say then we do some training and we improve your ability to move your weight side to side rapidly. This test should be able to detect that. You should improve your scores on this test. We should know how much of an improvement this change in function should represent on this test. So if all those things are there, then we'd say, hey, it seems to be a good functional test. I'll knock on all the doors of the PT clinics and say, hey, you should use this. Look, it's valid, it's reliable, it's repeatable, it's responsive, it's a good predictor of these negative bad things down the road. So if you were to use it, then you might be able to help your patients more by identifying this particular aspect of function that we currently have a hard time measuring. We'll add this test in and it will help us round out our test batteries so that we can do a good job of identifying what each individual patient's particular area of function is that they should focus on to reduce their risk. So that's the whole idea. So far, I have only made it this far. And I'm kind of having problems with that step right there. So it might look like I'm spinning my wheels with my little graphic, and that's on purpose. we're trying to get past this, a little sticking point with repeatability of the test. And so that's what I'm going to tell you about today. I'm going to tell you about what did I do to demonstrate that it is valid. Well, first, easy to conduct. I'm going to show you some video so that you see what this test looks like. Then I'll show you what I did to attempt to demonstrate that it is a valid representation of the aspects of function I'm talking about. And then I'll talk about what we have been doing to assess whether it's reliable or not. And now I know that at 10 after, I'm supposed to stop and have questions. Shall I do that now, or shall I show the test videos first? You want to see the videos first, because you're like, what are you talking about? Okay, then let's have a look. Here we have some here. So what we have done is we have created a test where it is quite simple to do, where you tap on a little step. This is based on a lab-based study from, gosh, almost 20 years ago that demonstrated that a step up, a step tap, is the greatest challenge to this side-to-side motion, more so than the step forward that I was demonstrating, right? So when you lift your foot and tap it on a step, do you see how it forces you onto one foot? And then you put it back down and it forces you to the other side. So doing this, you can see my side-to-side motion. So this is really challenging that. If I am very fast and can do a lot of taps on the step, that would mean that I very aggressively moved my body weight back and forth, that I was able to change my sideways direction very rapidly in a very robust manner. We also, I will tell you about a modified version where here in this video on the left, you saw someone tapping a piece of tape that was on the center of the tape, assuming that if we had a center tap, that would make us move side to side more. Stealing my thunder a little bit, when we ran into repeatability problems, we thought, well, maybe we need to simplify. Is this tape really necessary? Let's test a second version, a modified version, and see if it holds up as well. I don't know the full answer to whether it holds up as well yet, but I'll show you what that looks like. That would be this one here, where you just tap straight forward. Don't worry about that piece of tape. Just tap the step anywhere you want and go as fast as you safely can. Okay? Some people really go at it. You'll see a big range in scores in some of the graphs that I'll show you. And the idea is, in 20 seconds, how many taps can you do? 1, 2, 3, 4. We count it when the foot returns to the ground. Some people can do 9 in 20 seconds. Some people can do more than 30 in 20 seconds. So there's a broad range of functions so far in the group that we have measured. And we also know that it's not for everyone. Some individuals would not attempt it. And so for part of our study, we took our research group into assisted living communities in order to be able to find participants who wouldn't be able to march across our campus, park in our visitors lot, come on over, come up the stairs to our building. And that, when you do a study on a campus, you are naturally having some selection bias. It's selecting in only people who can get there. People who have the confidence that getting there in itself isn't so insurmountable, that they will go there and then do all your testing, right? So you know that you're getting a pretty high-functioning community-dwelling group. And so we took our research team out into the assisted living communities that were very gracious enough to help us communicate with residents who could sign on if they wanted to. And that's where we really rounded out the range of functional performance. And in those environments, we found that some people could not or would not attempt this kind of a test. And so if this test has any utility going forward, it's not for the very functionally compromised, who we already see other signs. They've already had other signs exhibited that they're having difficulty with the basics of mobility. It would be for the higher functioning folks to see if they're kind of dropping to a level where we should be concerned and try and really intervene in this particular aspect of function. Okay. One more thing. So what am I going to do? The approach here is to correlate a lab-based measure of this function with just how many taps did they do, or number of steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If they did 20, does that mean they had a better representation of medial lateral motion as a quantified on my acceleration sensor that I attach to their back to measure their motion as they move side to side. So it's that I'm going to show you next, is that, that approach to correlating those two measures. I'm going to stop there and take questions, and then I'll show you the rest of it when we come back. Thank you.
We'll get them here. Okay, this is curious how high the step is and what determines how high you make the step.
It should be on.
Okay, is this better? Volume is back? Okay. Hold so. So the question was, based on a previous study that used that height of a step, and an exercise step is just readily available, and so it's lower than a typical stair step. We place people 15 centimeters in front of it to start, and that would be something different. That would become an accuracy test if they had to return their toe back behind the line. So it's start behind the line, ready, set, go, and then they tap as many times, and they don't worry about where their feet are on the floor, but they worry about where the foot is on the step.
Hi, my name is Bill. I'm currently using a cane because of an accident that I had. I fell. And my struggle is mostly with stairs in public places that have no handrails whatsoever. And I've got to go down. Going up's not so bad, but I've got to go down, and there's nothing to hang on to and nothing to catch me. And does the side-to-side program help with situations like that? Because I do have the cane when I'm going either up or down.
Does the side-to-side function help with that, or is that what you're asking? Does this involve side-to-side motion? Is that what you're asking?
I don't know. I feel so like it's such a dangerous thing to step down on a tall step outdoors with concrete all the way down to the bottom and so on, that it makes it difficult for me to do that. And so I basically take a step, bring the other foot with me, then take another one all the time using the cane.
Yes. I think it's key, the use of the cane. Sure. So I think that it's key to use the cane when you need the cane. On the stairs, it's also important. What that does for us, any kind of assistive device, whether it's a cane or a walker, is it increases our functional base of support. So if you, it's like having another foot out there so that you can just kind of lean a little bit farther than you could if it was just your own 2 feet. So it widens that whole functional base of support, which is really useful. It is an ongoing hazard that we still have community spaces that are not fully accessible. It is worrisome, and I deal with that with the lab that I work in. We have requested access with handrail. There's at least a wall to push against, and so it's something that we struggle with, and hopefully that will be something that continues to improve. So I can't say a whole lot about that, to be honest, other than use the assistive device in the way that you're trained to by your physical therapist, and they have specific recommendations for going up and going down that can help you feel more stable and comfortable. That generally mean that you're presenting a good base to step into, right? Another thing I will mention about assistive devices that I think is really cool is that there is something about even just a light touch that makes a difference. Is it okay if I go back to this microphone right now? Is that okay to go back and forth? Because I just kind of...
We'll have to get rid of one of these then. Which one is this one?
Okay. Well, maybe we could just temporarily turn that off. Am I? Okay. So we have some interesting research that a light touch on something increases your balance performance at every age. So it provides more sensory input to the body so that the brain knows where you are and how to stabilize you better. So that can be some fixed object. And there have been interesting studies to figure out, does it have to be an unmoving object? What if it is something that you're holding on to that sways with you? And that doesn't work, right? It has to be some fixed object like an assistive device as well. So there is something supportive to your balance about having your hand on something that gives you an extra reference point. So it's not only the mechanical stability of increasing your functional base of support on the ground, but it's also that improved sensory capacity or enhanced sensory input that improves your postural stability, which is a pretty cool thing that our brain does, to add that in as another input. Some weird things that our brain does. It seems that if we are carrying something in our hands, like groceries, if we have a destabilizing event like a slip or a trip, it would make sense that our brain would ditch that and use these to grab something useful, right? Instead, what it does is it grabs whatever it's got, even if it's not very useful. And so that has led to some interesting studies. They put people in a perturbation platform in a study up in Toronto, and they gave people a couple of things. In one case, they gave them a fully functional cane that reached the ground. In another condition, they gave them a cane top. That's just the top that doesn't touch the ground. So they're holding a useless functional device, right? In both cases, the brain holds on to it. Now, there's a handrail on this perturbation platform. They were wondering what would happen when they interacted with the handrail under these circumstances of carrying something. And even if it's clearly a useless something, the brain will still keep your hand holding on to it, but it will spare a couple of fingers to hook on to the handrail. Now, so then, it's not ideal, right? It's like drop the useless thing and grab the stable thing, but that has to be trained, and it seems that it can be trained. This is something that maybe one day will make it into our clinical interventions that we see in our physical therapy offices, for example, where if a person is trained to do that, then they can. So this same group up in Toronto, they put people on another training perturbation platform that lurches forward or back or side to side, and they put foam blocks to keep their legs from moving so that they couldn't take a step. And they had to rely on their hands to stabilize themselves. But they gave them shopping bags and trained them, when you get thrown off balance, drop it and grab the rail. And they did. And they improved in their ability to use recovery grasping reactions. And so it might be that that's part of our future, is not only training, okay, how well can you stand nicely still? Let's do it on one foot. Let's do it like this. Now I'm sorry, I'm going to have to push you a little bit so that you practice what really happens in the world, and that is that you have to take a recovery step. Okay, and now let's do that and practice the other safety recovery motions that we have, which is our reach and grasp mechanism as well. So that was a little bit of a tangent on the topic of the cane. There's a lot to talk about there.
Turn that mic off. All the way off.
It's orange.
All the way off.
I guess I don't know how to do all the way off.
There, it's off there.
All right, sorry for that back and forth. My name is Franca. The question I had is about your test. and you got to the point where it had to be repeated. Now, everybody is a different mass and a different height and different physical abilities, period. So it's hard to imagine how you can get the same results. I was thinking that maybe the test would be beneficial for people that have a sudden loss of a function. And then you can measure that sudden loss as opposed to trying to as a predictor for how the general public may have a loss. So anyway, that getting back to the standard issue, everybody is a different body mass, different height. How can you get the same results?
Yes, that is a good question. So for my current round of the study, we're measuring leg length. We always measure height, and it has not correlated with performance so far, but that doesn't necessarily mean that something about a person's dimensions wouldn't. So we're looking at that a little closer now. What about the leg length? Is there something about that where this would be a smaller, you know, just looking at the hip joint flexion, a smaller flexion for a taller person than for a shorter person, right? So it can be different. How much that makes a difference in the ultimate performance, we're not sure. And that's something we're pressing on with my current round of the study to be able to detect that. We have not seen it correlate with body weight, interestingly. And like I said, not body height either, but we're having a closer look. Another way to think about that is that in the environment, things are the dimensions that they are, and people have to deal with the world. So smaller people and taller people have to deal with typical step heights. And so that's another way to think about it, is if we think that this step height is somehow useful in the world, as like it's a, you know, it's a maybe a little taller than these steps that are leading up to the auditorium, then no matter a person's body size, they still have to be able to negotiate a particular minimum height. And so it's an interesting question that I don't know fully how much it impacts our measurements or the performance of the individuals, but that's something that we're going to be tracking. And if we find something there, we might take a real deeper dive into it, because we might want to measure the hip joint angles, for example, and see just how much of a difference does this make. Is it enough of a difference that we should really present a different step height based on your own height? So we would tell a clinician, well, here's your scale, here's your little table. Present this step height if they're between these body heights, and present this smaller step height if they're within these shorter body heights. And if we were to ever go in that direction, it would have to be really, really warranted, because every step that makes the test harder to administer will make it less likely to be adopted. And so it's at that balance there that we're trying to figure out, like, what's the optimum utility here? Yeah.
All right, I think we're ready for our break. Be careful going out. There's steps.
Okay, so I showed you the test. We've got this tapping test. I put a low step in front of people and asked them within 20 seconds, how many times can you tap this step? So let's do this as fast as you safely can. So we started with that work in 2013 to try and correlate these lab-based measures with how many times they could tap the step, which I'm referring to here as number of steps. And so the first round of the study brought in 40 community-dwelling older adults to do this study. And we measured side-to-side motion with an accelerometer. And I'm wearing it right now, so it's back here under my waistband. I've just taped it to my back. If you come into the lab to participate in my study, we will fix it with Velcro onto a little belt and wrap it around your waist in order to make that measurement of your motion of your body. And so what we know is about acceleration represents your ability to change your velocity. So if you have a high acceleration, that means the velocity changed rapidly. So if I'm just walking straight forward, I just accelerated because I sped up, right? I changed my velocity rapidly. Now in the context of this side-to-side motion, we know that if we're changing direction, we're also changing our velocity back and forth. So acceleration also is a way to measure our ability to rapidly change our speed side to side. Because we have to stop and speed up again, right? I've stopped here momentarily before I go to the other direction. So acceleration is a good way to measure this side-to-side motion. And we know that in previous studies, people who had a higher fall risk, meaning they had been falling, they exhibited slower walking speeds and lower accelerations, so really more conservative accelerations, whereas folks who are a bit more robust will charge out, right? And you'll have higher accelerations. Now, this is in the forward-back direction, the up-down direction, and the side-to-side direction. All three directions have been studied in this way. So our expectation is if a person is changing their velocity more rapidly, then they are going to be exhibiting higher accelerations. So I'll demonstrate what those accelerations look like. It's my little guy. So I've just got to get my device turned on. So hold on, I'm going to restart. So on the far right of the screen, you can see my real-time accelerations. And that's because I'm wearing this accelerometer here. So if I jump up and down, sorry about the sound on that, then you can see that vertical direction in the red. If I'm going to try and move side to side rapidly, then you'd see the other directions start to pick up a little bit here. We can see that in the blue kind of color there. If I try and do some forward-back accelerations, then we might see the green start to pick up a little bit more as well. So if I walk very carefully, you can see that everything's really muted. But as soon as I'm charging out, you see these more robust accelerations that occur. And if you see that if I do something like this step tap, then you may start to see a cyclical motion. That you can start to pick out a pattern, and that's a pattern that I'm looking for here in my research. So we can see kind of an oscillating mess of noise there. And so I'm just going to walk you through the basics of what I do with this kind of acceleration signal to quantify this ability to move your weight side to side rapidly. All right, so here's an example. So this is not real time. This is having come out of the computer program I wrote. I write computer programs in MATLAB, which is just one of the software languages. It imports these acceleration signals and then examines them to find peaks in them. This is a painstaking process. I have banged my head against the screen many times. The idea is to try and automate this computer language to find these peaks in an automated way, but everybody's different. Did you know that your acceleration signals are quite unique? And so that means that I have to babysit this quite a lot. I have to look at every single graph, or my students do, in order to figure out, okay, did it appropriately find these steps in here in order for us to pull apart this signal? The first thing we do is that we filter the medial-lateral signal. Medial-lateral is the jargon for side-to-side motion. So this side-to-side motion we know is going on a predictable pattern. We filter that signal really severely, which means we strip out all the noise to find this basic pattern that's in the middle strip here, right in here. And based on that, then we find these step peaks in the anterior, posterior, the forward, backward signal that correlate really well with those taps, those steps back on the floor. Okay? So we're able to pull out events from the signal that represent the sideways motion and the foot returning to the floor, because it gives a little jar, a little impact. Now, based on that, then we can identify the steps. Once we can identify the steps, we can identify how long each one took. So we can look at this in between there. We can look at the time difference between each step and figure out what was the step time for this step, and what was the step time for the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So if it's a shorter time, then it was a faster step. And also, if they're very regular, if those step times seem to be pretty consistent, we would call that rhythmic. And it turns out that that is a concept that relates to our function as well. There have been several studies that turn people loose with some sensors to detect their step times. And when folks are unable or no longer exhibit a rhythmicity of their steps, that correlates with fall risk and loss of function. So rhythmicity is an interesting factor related to gait performance in particular. It's some kind of a temporal patterning that relies on our nervous system functioning really well to maintain it. And I didn't ask people to be rhythmic. Neither did the other researchers who said go and walk for 2 minutes, you know. But those who were not rhythmic had more problems. So rhythmicity is interesting. And we were able to picture that or calculate that in a pretty simple way. So we have this series of step times here. We may have 20 step times during the course of this one trial. And if we just calculate the standard deviation of those step times, that gives us a concept of how variable they were. If they are very variable, then they are not consistent. If they're consistent, they're rhythmic. If they're very variable, they are not. So that's that concept of rhythmicity. We also looked at the acceleration magnitude. So here we are back to the less severely filtered side-to-side signal of the acceleration, which is the one that we think we're challenging with this test. We looked at the peaks of that acceleration signal. So how big are they? And the bigger, the more robust your change in velocity side to side. We also looked at how variable those were. Were they the same peaks? So in each of these steps here, was the peak quite the same? So up here, did each of these positive peaks reach the same level? And what about these negative peaks here? Did they reach the same level? So we looked at a peak-to-peak range and also the variability of those. And, here's my nice little graphic zooming in here to show that peak-to-peak to show you the difference between the high and the low within each step. And then look at how variable that is within a trial. So that's what we're looking at here, is indicators of how fast, how rhythmic, how effective or aggressive are you with your side-to-side motion, and how consistent is that? That's what we were able to measure with the little accelerometer on the low back. So in brief, what we found in this study, this gets at the validity. Does this little tapping on a step test tell us something about the variables that I'm trying to represent? This ability to shift your weight rapidly side to side. It turns out it seems to be a good reflection of several important variables. It's not a perfect reflection of any single one, but it's a good reflection of several. So here we go. Here's a graph showing us the number of steps that a person could make on the x-axis here along the bottom of the graph. So some folks could make closer to 10, some could make around 30 in this first group that we studied. And then we have the side-to-side acceleration magnitude along the y-axis here. Now, these numbers on the y-axis are a little funny because I had to do some statistical help for this non-parametric data. It was skewed results, which is not a bad thing. It's just a normal statistical problem. Some data are a nice bell-shaped curve, and some of them are a wonky curve. If they're a wonky curve, you have to be careful about how you handle it statistically. One way to go about that is with a log transformation, doing a logarithm function on it. So that's what makes these magnitude numbers on the y-axis a little weird. but it's still showing us a linear relationship between these two measures. A moderate relationship of a Pearson correlation of about 0.5 something. Okay? And we also, so what we see here is that people who could do more steps had a greater acceleration magnitude. We also see this one here. So this question, how consistent was the speed of the weight shifting motion? This was also interesting. So we have number of steps on the x-axis again, going horizontally along the bottom. So folks who could do more steps were more rhythmic. Okay? So this is, oh, I'm sorry, this one is not the, this was not the rhythmic. Sorry, the rhythmic is the next one coming up. This one is the acceleration variability. So the people who were able to do more steps actually had acceleration magnitudes that were all over the place. They were really variable. And this was not what we expected, but when we dug back in the research literature, we found a bunch of things that helped us to put it into some kind of a framework. And what that is that when we are moving fast, that as we get older and we attempt to step fast or move our position to a new place fast, we tend to overshoot and undershoot more than when we're younger. That means that I may intend to put my weight right over this foot, but I might overshoot a little bit more or undershoot the final position. As we get older, we tend to overshoot and undershoot more. And what we think is happening here is the folks who could go really fast could tolerate that. They could apply enough force that it didn't matter so much. And the folks who could not tolerate so much overshoot and undershooting that comes with moving fast side to side had to rein it in. They had to go slow because they weren't able to tolerate that unexpected position of your body that comes with moving so fast. That's what we think is happening there. So this next one, this one here is the rhythmicity bit. So how rhythmic? So higher performers, those who were closer to 30 steps, were more rhythmic. Now this is a downward negative trend, which means that their standard deviation or the variability of their step times was less. They were more consistent. A more variable step time would be a higher number on the y-axis. So those were over here, and those came along with the folks who were performing at a lower performance on this step-up test. So if they could only do 10, 15 steps, for example, then they were less rhythmic than the folks who were doing more steps. Okay, how are we doing so far? So we're seeing a moderate relationship with these interesting variables that we know from past research relate to fall risk in seniors. And so as far as figuring out if this is a good, valid test of function, there's some good news here. And the good news is that when you put these variables together, they can account for more than 62% of the variation in step performance on this little tapping test. That means there's still some amount of the performance that we cannot account for, right? So we have, pushing 40% of the performance that we cannot explain with the variables that I tried. So this is based on a multiple regression model where you offer up the variables to see which ones account for the most variance in your outcome measure, which is the number of steps they were able to do. Those who were able to do more steps were more aggressive with their side-to-side motion. They had greater accelerations. They seemed to be better able to tolerate the uncertainty of body position that comes with that, and therefore they exhibited higher variability in those peak accelerations, and they were more rhythmic. So it seems like this is interesting. The variable that I didn't have to enter in that round of the study that we're measuring now is just basic, in brief terms, do we have a concept of just speed of movement? So we've added in a variable that I'm wondering if it might increase the amount of variance we can explain. Can we add in a variable that shows that people who are faster, in general, not just at this weight shifting, but who can step faster, does that increase the ability of this test to tell us something useful? Does it tell us also about that? So that's something that we're looking at now is, can we make this percentage of the variance in number of steps, can we explain more of that if we add in this speed variable? that we're testing currently. All right, so that's my good news. There's also another little bit of good news, and that is that there is some good inter-rater reliability for this test. That means that if two experimenters watch the same performance, that they get the same number of steps. That it's not so hard to make a judgment about the scoring on this, that people score all over the place depending on who is watching the test. So that's called inter-rater reliability. What I'm showing in this graph is the first rater's score that they wrote down on their sheet of paper along the x-axis here, and then the second rater's score along the y-axis here. So for a good portion of our participants in the second phase of the study, we had two raters observing the same performance, and it came out to be very high reliability. I forgot to put the numbers in here, but the interclass correlation was above 0.9, which we are very happy with. And it's hard to get higher than that. A correlation of 1 would mean that all these dots are exactly on the line. And when that happens, that's pretend data. And so, and I have made pretend data like that before for a stats class for my students to see, like this is what it looks like, but this is not what happens. So we can see here, for example, that this first rater rated a couple scores at 20. The second rater rated one of those at 20, but the other one was maybe 19 or 18. So sometimes there is a little bit of mistake that can happen, but in general, the overall concept here is that the inter-rater reliability was high. And if I show that in another way, if we look at the mean scores from rater 1 and rater 2, there was no difference between these scores for these groups. So here we have a number of steps along the y-axis. And we have the first rater in blue and the second rater. That just means the second person in the room trained to count these steps. Theirs is in red, and we see that there was no difference between these scores when we compared the mean scores between the two raters. So that's good news. This is the original step-up test where I had them tapping the tape. And then the one over here, this is the modified step-up test where I said, ignore the tape, just tap straight forward. Okay? And it seems that there's promising results that the scores on the modified step test are not different than the scores on the first one. Whether they have a stronger or less strong relationship with my fancy variables, the acceleration variables, I don't know yet because I have a mountain of data to sift through before I can answer that question. So still don't have all the news to report. All right. Now, good news on validity. It's looking promising. I'm going to see if I can strengthen that in my next phase of the study. Good news on inter-rater reliability, but bad news on repeat testing, so the repeatability. So when I brought people back 1 week later, they all did better than the first week. If we had been trying to help them do better by doing some kind of intervention, I'd be thrilled. But this is a situation where we're trying to see, like, assuming that your function did not change within a week, how does it go? And they improved. So we're not sure what that means. But on its face, it's not good. I can't go to a PT clinic and say, hey, it's a really great test, but, you know, you're going to get a different score each time. That's not going to work out. We need to understand this a little bit more. Like, what went into this? Is it that people, that prior exposure helped them learn how to do it? Did it actually affect their function by having come in and done a battery of tests? We know that with strength tests, for example, if you do a strength test today, the strength performance is going to be enhanced for about a week. And that's because you've done something. That's because that was a bit of a stimulus to the nervous system. It wakes it up a little bit, makes it better able to create force in the coming time. This is what makes acute resistance training effects chronic. Well, it's part of it. There's also like improved machinery within the muscle itself. But there's also this neural part where the neurons become facilitated for a while. So was it that? Well, we wanted to know, can we improve this repeatability part of it? So I went into another phase of the study. And I didn't fix the problem yet. So a second round did not help this part. We added familiarization trials. We thought, all right, we're gonna make sure that at each time people come in, we get their best performance so that we know that each time we haven't left a little in the tank. And that maybe will improve repeatability, because we know from other studies that that's the best practice for improving repeatability is make sure people are well familiarized with the test. We did have everyone do 5 trials. Anybody who was in the room who participated in that remember saying, again? You want me to do this one again? Okay. And what we found in this next phase is that it takes about 4 trials for performance to stabilize. And so it means that so far, it looks like, before we can call it a score for the day, we need to do 4 trials. I wish it would have been 3. 3 is pretty reasonable. 4 is kind of asking a lot, so I'm not thrilled with that result, but statistically that's what came out of my 5 attempts, is that they didn't stabilize until trial 4. Trial 3 was still different, less than 5, but 4 wasn't. So that's where we're at with that. And we also tested the modified step test to see if it was more reliable. It also improved in the follow-up visit. So both versions of the test, whether you tap the tape or you don't, both are subject to this problem with repeat testing with some kind of systematic improvement on the second visit. We increased the time of follow-up to 2 weeks. We thought, well, whoops, we enhanced the nervous system. Let's let it kind of settle down again. And then we'll bring them back in, and then we'll see. And it still happened. So this is what that looked like on the second round of testing. This is a group that is our mixed function group, where we had some folks coming to campus, and then we found some folks by going out into the retirement facilities and assisted living communities as well. And we found that they improved. So this is now looking at trial 4, because now we know we shouldn't be comparing trial 1. We need to look at trial 4. How did trial 4 do? Well, everyone improved. Oh, darn it. So that's where I'm at right now, is trying to understand why. And by trying to not do too much testing each time people come in, because that can be a lot and people can get tired, I don't have enough information from these previous data sets to know. So right now, I'm going to tell you where we're at. So back to this early framework. I think it's easy to conduct. You just need a stopwatch to count the 20 seconds. You need a tape on the floor. Not sure if you need a tape on the step. You need a step, and that's all you need. And you need to count, right? So that first step, it seems clinically feasible. It seems like the validity is looking promising, and I'm testing more variables to see if we can account for more of the variance there. Adding in a speed variable, so those who are generally just faster, do they do better? So I think that 62% of the variance in the number of steps that we can account for, that we can predict with our variables, I think that might get higher, but I've been wrong before, so. This part here is where we're stuck. We're stuck at the reliability part. Inter-rater reliability looks good, so that's promising. But the repeat testing, the repeatability of this, to be sure that it's a stable test, is in question. And I'm not sure yet if I'm going to be able to fix it in order to proceed along here and ever recommend this test. So things we're looking at right now. We wonder, is the systematic improvement on this step-up test, is it due to one of these following things? Are people actually getting better in their function? So we didn't test enough other variables, other tests to know. If we had measured their strength again, was it better? If we had measured their power again, was it better? This time, we're measuring a whole host of things each time people come in, so that we can track the stability of each functional performance domain: strength, power, balance, walking function. How are they staying stable, but this test score is increasing? If so, that's not a good sign for this test being repeatable. If everything's improving, then it might mean, wow, okay, well, we're just kind of impacting their function when they come in and they're doing better. and scoring better the next time they come in? Are they maybe feeling so good about having come in and gotten some test results that they're now going out and they're just participating in everything, and they've started an intervention program, and they're doing this, and they're walking more, and they're doing more? We're trying to track that this time to understand what is it about this process that's leading to this systematic improvement in performance. Is it a learning or a practice effect? We're adding in a bit of a coordination measure this time that doesn't have to do with your ability to move and be on your feet side to side. So is there some ability of coordination generally that we've impacted here? That would be a neural sort of effect. Is it that some functional tests stabilize after like 2 or 3 tests, like come back each week, and then on the week 3, then you know that that's a good score? Is it like that? We're going to try and track that and figure it out. Or what if we wait longer? What if it's like 3 weeks, 4 weeks? Are they more repeatable under those circumstances? Or is it just not a good test? And if it's not, it kind of looks like it might be good for training, doesn't it? I mean, if people are getting better at it, if this is really challenging side-to-side motion, I'm not thinking that I want to turn my attention totally away from this idea, but it might not be a good assessment. So I don't know the answer to that yet, and that's where I'm working on right now. We're working on trying to do more to figure out, are these actual improvements in function, or are people just learning how to do the test better? What's going on here? That's what we're trying to figure out, and we're asking people to come in multiple times into our lab and do these tests to the best of their ability on each day and see what happens. And so I want to thank you for listening to all that, hopefully commiserating with my troubles a little bit, and also let you know that this doesn't, of course, happen just because I tried to do it. There's a whole bunch of student collaborators that were involved, the research participants who give of their time to come in, for our benefit. We try to give something back with a little bit of feedback on some of the performance measures so that you can know how your performance rates compared to age-appropriate normal results. We had community participation from this group. You might have seen emails from me before saying, hey, you want to come and join this? You want to come and listen to my students? You want to do this? Here's another study. So we appreciate that. And the community groups that have facilitated this as well, and internal funding from Willamette. And so up there in yellow, I do have some information sheets, some flyers. If you would like to know what the eligibility criteria are to come in and do this kind of study, either this one or maybe in the future, I'd love to give you a flyer so that if you'd like to participate in this kind of stuff, that you can. So thank you.
Hi, this is Mika. Is this on? Okay. A comment and a question. My comment is, and I don't know how you factor for this, but when I did this, coming back, I had great confidence. Mm-hmm. I know what I'm doing. I know what this is about, and you know, so that's a mental thing. The question is, when you get to the next one, which is it useful, or whatever that next bubble is?
Good predictor.
Is it a good predictor?
Right.
I assume you have started out with a hypothesis that it would be, but would that involve actually tracking for some years to see if people do fall?
Yeah, that's a good point. So let me address your first point first, which is when you came back into the lab, you felt more confident. You knew what this was all about, and so you felt like you could maybe just turn up the gas a little bit more. And we're trying to get a sense of that too, because you know, a lot of what happens in research is there's always something that's unmeasurable, right? Something we don't know, that we might see or we might hear, but we have no systematic way of quantifying that. We're trying to systematically quantify that this time. How did this compare to your previous visit, you know, on these various ways that you felt? Did you do something different this week? You know, how are you feeling? Are you feeling good? Are you feeling bad? Are you feeling more confident? Are you feeling less? So that's a really important point, that we don't know about the motivation and confidence in a perfect way from day to day, but we're trying to press on that. Now, on the second point, if we get past this sticking point and we understand, like, this seems to be a stable test, like a repeatable thing, reliable, we can recommend it. Well, we can't yet unless we know something more about it. Like, does this test help us see the future? Does it help us predict a few negative outcomes that are important, like falls, like loss of mobility function, like hospitalization, indicators of a real loss of function? And the way that you do that, now a first step is to bring people in and ask them, hey, have you fallen? Have you not? And then compare those groups on this performance. Now, that's called a retrospective study. And in that kind of study, the problem, it can be a good first start, right? It can tell us if this is a relevant concept. The problem is that having the experience of having a fall, or an injurious fall in particular, can change something about the way a person moves. It can change something about their willingness to be very, to do a test like this in a very robust way. And so we can't be sure that it really is a predictor. So the second thing you said is, do you have to track them over some years? And that's the best way. That's called a prospective study, where you bring everybody in who's the same in the beginning, right? And then you use a variety of tests. And if I were to hopefully be able to proceed to this step, then we would not do only this test. We would need to know if it adds to the current clinical battery of tests that are used to evaluate whether someone's at a higher risk or not. And we would want to know if adding this test in actually improves our ability to predict if someone is at a higher risk, and we quantify that by this people who score below a certain amount going on to have this negative outcome of either a fall or some other kind of mobility-related problem. And so that's how that would work. A study like that would need a lot of people. It would need follow-up. You can't just contact people a year later and say, oh, how many falls were there? We don't remember. Was that this year? Was that last year? Was that 3? Was it, I don't know. There was that trip. So you have to follow up every month, like with a postcard sort of thing or a call. So this is a time-intensive research study that would evaluate that step in order to figure out, great, now that we have this whole data set, we can see if we were better able to predict folks who had a bad outcome within a 3-year span or whatever, based on how many steps they were able to do on this score. Does this seem to be adding to our current test battery? That's what that would do.
Interventions?
People are. People do have a dominant side for both their arms and their legs. And the way that that's quantified in the research can vary a little bit depending on what the task is. So sometimes people will say, all right, take a step forward, and then that foot you chose to step forward with must be your dominant foot. Or they'll say, stand on one leg, and the one you choose is your dominant foot. Or they'll say, kick a ball, and the one you choose is your dominant foot. So it depends on the context what sort of evaluation they would do to judge which is your dominant side. The impact that would have on a test like this, I don't know yet. It is cyclical. It requires both. And whether that would maybe reduce the accuracy of tapping the step, the tape on the step with one side and not the other, is a question that I wouldn't be able to detect from the way I'm collecting the data right now. I think that would require a different focus for that, where we need to screen that in order to know if everyone has the same dominant side or not. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, this is Don. Thanks so much for doing this.
This is comment more to the group. One of the things when we join ICL, there's several goals of membership. One of which is give back to the university where you can. Now what a beautiful opportunity in situations like this to really give a little time to participate in the study, but it really is giving back to the university, and that's one of the real valuable components of being on a university campus. Besides that, I always enjoy working with the students. It makes me feel younger, even though they're testing my senility.
Thank you for that. I hope to see many of you. I didn't know actually the number of folks who would be here. I brought 40 flyers in case folks are interested, but of course I can ask for the flyer to be distributed via email for it to reach others if needed. So.
This is Becky, and I'm curious if you've considered or have done any kind of screening for depression or cognitive impairment, since they were part of that circle.
Right. Sorry, before I answer that, I'd like to swing back to your last comment about working with the students. And then I promise I will try to remember your question about cognitive function. See it? Did you catch that? Yeah, right there. Okay. So I teach a class on aging and health and functional assessment. And you know, college students aren't usually clamoring to study aging, right? But it's an elective in our exercise and health science major, and a lot of our students are wanting to go into a clinical field, and so they do see it as an area they need to learn about. So it's not like they wake up, you know, every morning, oh, I really hope I find out what goes on when we get older, you know? I mean, of course they're in their youth and they have other things they're thinking about. But I do observe and I hear from them that this is a mutual benefit, that they come out feeling really many things. They feel inspired, they feel grateful for the contribution of the seniors who come in. One thing that we do in that class is we have senior volunteers come in from the community who participate in functional tests here in our gym here at Willamette. So we do that 4 times during the semester when I teach that class. So the students are learning how to do some of the functional tests that we see in the research literature that they'll do in a clinical environment, so that they can get some hands-on practice and learn how to work with folks. And so they come away from it feeling really happy to have had that chance for that intergenerational experience, and coming away from it appreciating the variety and not coming away confirming the stereotype that you see of older adults in movies, you know, the caricature that you see here and there. They come away appreciating the variability in personality, in functional level, and they appreciate that. So that's something that's really always rewarding. They come out of it like, wow, I didn't know I was gonna feel this way or have this experience, and now they do. I can't remember, what was your question? So in our study, we have not measured depression. I have in previous work, in previous studies. There are surveys, those are typically questionnaires that you have a variety to choose from. One that is relevant to older adults is called the Geriatric Depression Scale, for example. It's one model that is used. You know, sharing those feelings are sensitive. I don't bring that into my class to have the students ask our participants to divulge that level of personal detail, just because I know it can be sensitive. And that's not to say that I wouldn't ever, because it's so constructive to learn how to talk about it. But it is asking a bit much of our participants, when I would never want to blindside them with that. Oh, by the way, did you know today we're asking you about this in a series of 20 questions? So that's kind of a big deal. we do a simple cognitive function screen that's not diagnostic, but it's a screen. It's called the Mini Mental State Exam, and it asks you to do a variety of things that involve recall and name this object and follow these instructions and things like that. And we understand that in many of our studies, if we're doing a study on campus and a person took my phone call and they returned it, they actually got in some transport device or something, they made it to our location, and they were able to come on in, and find us on time. They didn't not show up. Those are all good indicators that a person is going to pass this screening instrument. And so it's not one that detects small changes in cognitive function. We're not evaluating that. That would be an interesting study. And there are a variety of ways we could measure cognitive function in ways that would be very relevant to this kind of physical performance, but that's not the area that we're taking right now.
Oh, Paul here. Maybe this is a male standpoint, but I can just imagine myself taking that test and say, the first time I did it, let's just say I did 15, and you call me back again. I say, well, I know I did 15. I'm going to really put the effort to do more.
Yeah.
And you can see that in that second or third video you showed, that one guy there who is dressed as, he was a very competitive person. And so this wasn't a test, this was a competition.
Yes, this happens. And I know that in previous versions of the study, participants were allowed to see what they did last time. It wasn't what I thought would happen, but it happened. And so this time, we don't divulge that. We don't tell them what they did. I know that I personally, when I'm doing these tests, I'm not very good at counting them at the same time, right? So I would need someone to count them and tell me what my score was. These are not scores we're sharing. So we're hoping that not adding in that competition with your best performance, we're hoping to guard against that by not flagging that. Hey, you got 33 last time, just saying. But I can't be sure. I can't 100% guard against that. But we're at least not trying to promote it and facilitate it. But I tell you something that's entertaining. And in one of my previous studies, how many years ago, 15, getting two older gentlemen together to take turns with strength testing. Now that's a competition.
Oh.
I tell you what, those strength scores were through the roof for those two.
Oh, one more question here. I'm sure you've kept height of stair constant throughout all your trials. And I'm just wondering if you were to lower the height of the stair, could you get more steps in as a corroborative variable? And do you have the same dress? Does sometimes a participant come in tight pants, another loose clothing? I mean, do you try and keep everything as non-variable within the testee as possible?
Right. Well, whether a person would do more steps with a shorter step, I don't know. I think that we would have to test that to be sure. And I think that's an interesting question, and really the direction I've wondered is whether it should be higher because, stair steps are higher. And so I'm not sure about that, and that's a variable that's in question for sure. It's is this the right height? And we have to keep in mind logistical issues we have to have a same height, an achievable height, and how much does it matter? We're not sure yet, but that's something that we're keeping an eye on. As far as a person's attire each time, we don't go so far as to take a picture and say, wear those sweatpants next time, but I might. But we just ask them to wear loose clothing, give them a picture of what we're doing, closed-toed shoes, walking shoes, and clothes that you can stand up and sit down a whole bunch of times and feel comfortable. So that's what we try to do, but you're right that there are other factors that could be influencing this variability, and we're not sure. Yeah.
Hi, in the back, George. I was wondering, in that step test that you repeat, and you wanted to get it up maybe to the 5th time to kind of see a leveling. Have you looked at how well the 2nd or 3rd might predict that 5th? And if there's too much variability, you'd have to, of course, not use that, but maybe you could. Good
point. Like if, yeah. So if we could come up with some algorithm that predicts their best trial, like their 4th or 5th, based on what their 1st or 2nd was. I think that's an interesting idea I had not thought of that could help simplify things. So if we could assume everyone's going to do a couple steps better, so assume that they would get there after 2 trials, something like that would be interesting to investigate. Right. That's a good point.
Janet over here. This is again on the improvement over the couple of weeks. I saw a program that with brain imaging that people actually practice in their sleep with. So I was wondering if it's a simple enough thing that people might come back to when they're thinking about it and they're actually practicing in their heads, even if they're not practicing beside their bed or something.
That's a good question. So that's a similar thing in what you're describing is like mental imagery, mental practice. And we know that trains the neural pathway in the brain to strengthen the connections between the neurons that are involved in that movement. And we know that that's a way to improve performance and practice skills, even if you're not actually physically doing them. So there is research that supports this idea that mental practice can improve actual performance. And so that's an interesting idea. Thank you for mentioning it. Yeah.
This is Jim. Getting back to that height of the step, do you take into account and track age, height, weight of participants? And
yes.
Do you see a correlation by the size and whatnot?
We are not seeing a correlation based on size so far. And so the weight and the height have not correlated with the step performance on these tests. But we are now wondering if that's really telling us what we need to know, because some people are tall with very long legs and some people are tall with a long torso. And so we're not sure if the variable that really matters is coming out in the height measurement. And so we're measuring the hip height now to get a sense of, to kind of zoom in on the part of the body most relevant to the work that's being done to kind of get up to that height and tap it. So for a short person with shorter legs, that would be like a really high level of flexion of the body, but for a very tall person, it could be, less motion. And so we're measuring something, we're measuring that now in order to get a closer look at that and see how much that might affect performance and whether it's a big enough difference for it to matter for a clinician or not. We don't know yet. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, I'm Karen Bender, and you say, would you like to be a participant? And I heard Dawn saying that it was good for us to, do this joining and sometimes in ICL. And we probably got that speech back in 2000, well, was it 13 that you
But they came before?
Yeah.
I came with Maggie and Theo maybe in 2014.
Okay, well, it seems like it's been forever back when we did this study before. And I can't remember if it was here at Willamette or was it down at the Y?
At the YMCA that year.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's where it was.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and so how do you sign up then? Do we line up after class or what?
That's right, I've got my stopwatch ready. I've got my motion sensor, here it is. There it is. Well, you would email me or call me and we'll start the conversation. I can't have anybody too young for this one, only folks 70 and up, so sorry to those of you who that might disqualify. And so we can I have some flyers I can distribute so folks can see if this particular study is of interest. And even if this particular one isn't, if you'd like to be in my spreadsheet of people who'd like to participate in such things, let me know that, and you can decline all of the studies I offer to you, or you can participate in all of them. And so that's something that you can also know, that there are studies down the road and class opportunities that I will offer up. If someone's in my spreadsheet, then they'll have a chance to say yes or no each time. Yeah.